'Tis the spooky season. Yes, I've shaved, which is for the Halloween-themed opening credits that I've been planning on doing for the month of October. And I'm also wearing my sweatshirt for the first time in a while. Feels a little funny. But anyway, to start off the month of October, I'm going to talk about a classic horror comedy that I have loved since I was 10 years old, and is considered by many to be one of the greatest comedies ever made and one of the best mixes of the genres. I don't own the movie on a solo DVD, but this will give you an idea. The movie is Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, and it is an all-time classic, and this movie is very special to me. And before I get into the story, let me explain how I got introduced to it. Back in 2005, Abbott and Costello movies, and I'm pretty sure they still are, but in 2005, Turner Classic Movies was playing a lot of Abbott and Costello, particularly their crossovers with the Universal Monster Classics. And my grandfather recorded two of their movies, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, on Fujifilm tape. And I used to watch this tape like a lot, all the time, and when I got the Best of DVD Volume 3 set, I mostly just used this to watch Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. And I watch the movie about maybe once a year, usually around the Halloween season or certain times of the year when I really feel like it. And I loved Abbott and Costello, and I used to watch their movies a lot, pretty excessively, from elementary school to all the way to middle school. And I still watch them every so often, not as much as I did when I was younger, but I still do, and they are truly one of the greatest comedy teams that ever lived. And the things they do, when you watch Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, there's a certain uniqueness to them that just can't be imitated, and it's a little hard to believe that what they're doing is actually them. You just haven't seen a comedy team like them in so many years, and there have been several skinny straight men, fat funny men comedians, and you can see a lot of influence in those teams that obviously come from Abbott and Costello. And I think a good example is Chris Farley. Okay, I'm not sure Lou Costello was a major influence on Chris Farley, but there's a lot of similarities between the two, especially in the childlike goofiness that Costello had, and I can kind of see that bit of that in Chris Farley. Chris Farley and David Spade were their own comedic team, but Abbott and Costello, I could see the ground blocks for those later teams being built. And when I rewatch Abbott and Costello movies, they still make me burst out laughing and just roll. It just feels great, and I will admit there are a few things that could get a bit grating. Like, the whole getup is Lou is an idiot and Bud is also an idiot, but he's also a bigger asshole, and he's always mistreating Lou, putting him down, acting like Lou's the screw-up when really Bud Abbott's the one fucking everything up. And sometimes the mistreatment can get a bit much for me, and also sometimes Lou Costello, sometimes his, I wouldn't say his stupidity, but his wimpiness could be really frustrating. Just like in a lot of Abbott and Costello's movies, whenever Lou sees something that he thinks is scary, he gets so overwhelmed with fear that he can barely speak, and he just sputters like and by the time he finally has the courage to speak up, whatever's scaring him has left, and the other characters don't know what the hell he was talking about. In fact, even though he's sputtering, the others don't notice. And there is a little bit of that in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, but it's not the worst, and the worst it ever got was in Hold That Ghost and African Screams. And I do like those movies, but those kind of scenes could really get to me. And also, another thing about Abbott and Costello that could get a little grating after you see them do it in every movie. I mean, because they always played the same characters pretty much every time. Actually, a few movies they tried some new stuff, like in The Time of Their Lives. And that's a great movie. It's the most un-Abbott and Costello film they ever did. But yeah, like, Abbott and Costello, they never really played likable characters, and something that I really hate in comedy is when the characters are unlikable. Like, even if what they're doing is funny, it really bugs me when they are just unlikable assholes. But for Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges, it doesn't bug me as much. Maybe it's because it's older material before this kind of thing became a really bad cliche, but another aspect is, I guess the whole unlikable characters in comedy storyline that really bugs me is when the unlikable characters, it's obvious that whoever is writing these characters or coming up with the storyline is expecting whoever's watching to sympathize or relate. And I think the worst example of that is The Big Bang Theory. The characters in that show I find to be very smug, very manipulative, very mean, and I just can't relate to them or like them in any way. And I guess with Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges, the deal was you weren't supposed to really like them. I mean, you could sympathize with them at times. Abbott and Costello, despite doing the same routine for their careers, they could really act. And the characters were not supposed to be likable. They were supposed to, and the audience wasn't expected to like them. They were just supposed to enjoy the slapstick and their funny lines and enjoy the antics and the pain they got into. I guess because you're not supposed to like them like this, like they are okay people, I think that sort of helps their movies and their routines work. It didn't work all the time, but it did work more often than it does today with the shit that comes out. And Abbott and Costello, they were my childhood, and they were a major part of my childhood, and it's a lot of good, cheery nostalgia and good memories for me watching these movies. And their humor could really make me roll, make me hurt, and almost piss my pants. So yeah, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is it's the second real film that I ever really watched of them, and it's also the first movie that introduced me to the Universal classic monsters. The Frankenstein monster, Count Dracula, the Wolfman. And I saw this movie before I got into the original monster series with Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Lon Chaney Jr. And some of the stuff in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein could be a little confusing, but not extremely much. There's a big debate as to whether or not the Abbott and Costello movie is a direct sequel to the classic Universal series, or if it's just a standalone film using these iconic characters. And something that really makes people think it's a standalone film, and this is something that's been going on for ever since it came out back in 1948. Something that makes people debate whether or not it's a direct sequel is that in the last Universal monster film that had all three of these very famous monsters, the Wolfman was apparently cured of his werewolf-ness, but in this film he still has the curse. I don't know, maybe it's like the Highlander series where all future sequels ignored Highlander 2: The Quickening. I haven't watched House of Dracula in many years, but I remember it being kind of a lousy movie, so I guess I'd like to think that Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is in some way a sequel to the original movies. And if a sequel deserved to be ignored in that franchise, it was House of Dracula. I just feel so... I may seem a little awkward, but I feel so giddy inside. This is my first Halloween-themed episode, and I haven't checked out Abbott and Costello in a bit, so I'm having a lot of feelings right now. So I guess without further ado, let's talk about the plot. A funny thing that happens with most of these movies that start with the title Abbott and Costello is that they're, like, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 movies, every movie they made, they always played characters with names, but the movies would still be called Abbott and Costello. I get it. It was to advertise that it was this legendary team, but the characters they played always had different names other than their own. And in Meet Frankenstein, Bud Abbott's character's name is Chick, and Lou Costello's character name is Wilbur. He played another Wilbur in Coming Round the Mountain. That's another movie for another day. But anyway, Chick and Wilbur are movers at a mail company, I guess, or a luggage company, and they have recently been sent 2 crates that are supposed to go to this wax museum called McDougal's House of Horror. And the crates are labeled as Dracula and the Frankenstein monster. And the twist? No shit. It really is Dracula and the Frankenstein monster. And Lou is the only one to see the truth, and everybody, when the monsters disappear, everybody thinks that Bud and Lou have stolen them. And we find out that Dracula has stolen the monster and is planning to make the monster his servant. And he's working with this evil seductress doctor to find a new brain for the monster so that the monster will obey Dracula's every command. For those who don't know, the original Frankenstein story goes that Dr. Frankenstein, when he made the monster, put a brain in that, unaware to him, was a brain of a mad criminal. So that's why the monster is, yeah, a monster. And what brain does Dracula's partner, Dr. Monet, plan to put in the monster? Her dim-witted boyfriend's, who happens to be Lou Costello. And while Bud and Lou are being investigated by the insurance company and the asshole who runs the wax museum, they are contacted by Lawrence Talbot, who is the Wolfman, played by the original Wolfman himself, Lon Chaney Jr. And Lon Chaney, around this film, it's obvious he knows the character inside and out. And Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, it's an interesting mix of genres because it is a comedy, but at the same time it is a horror film too, and it switches back and forth between the genres sometimes within only a few seconds. Quentin Tarantino said that Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was his favorite film as a child, and that it influenced him in the mixing of genres and switching of tones. And I can totally see that, because yeah, it can switch from intensity to funny just like that, and sometimes it can be both at the same time. A good example is when Lon Chaney is sleeping in the room next to Bud and Lou, and he tells Lou to lock the door, and no matter what happens, do not let him out. So he locks him in, but then he realizes that Talbot has forgot his bag, so he unlocks it, goes in, and it seems like Talbot is gone, and then all of a sudden we see that he has become the Wolf Man. So Lou, being the idiot he is, decides to leave a note, and on the way out grabs an apple, and he just narrowly misses getting mauled by the Wolf Man. And after locking the door again, trapping the Wolf Man inside, he looks at the apple and he's like, I wonder if he counted these. He might have. So he almost unlocks it, and the Wolfman's standing there just ready to strike. And then Lou on the outside, after thinking, that's a new one for him, after thinking for about 10 seconds is like, maybe he didn't. So he relocks, and it is both funny, but yeah, you can feel the tension and suspense there. Overall, Lon Chaney, he does a good job. Talbot, it's obvious that he's very depressed and he's got a very down view of life and the world, being the Wolfman, and that he still suffers. And Bud and Lou don't get it, or Lou's too stupid, not realizing how insensitive he can be at times. It's the 40s. Everybody was insensitive back then, unintentionally. And scenes where Talbot is suffering, you feel a little bit of the pain, but you can also laugh a little. It's kind of tragic, but it does work. Last thing to say is Lon Chaney was a great actor. He played more Universal monsters than any other actor. And like most greats, he was resorted to doing crap at the end, and if you want to find out, look it up on the internet. You'll find out how the end of his life was. They also got the original Universal Dracula himself to come back, Bela Lugosi. And this is very funny. I didn't find this out till after I saw pretty much all the Universal monster movies. Bela Lugosi, who was best known for playing Count Dracula in 1931, despite it being his most well-known role, and unlike Boris Karloff or Lon Chaney Jr., Bela Lugosi only played Dracula twice. The 31 movie and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I just think that's very interesting to know, and when Universal was trying to find someone to play Dracula, Bela's manager, I think, told Universal that they should be ashamed, saying that they owed the part to him. And maybe this other story is not true, but it was rumored, like, maybe they got this from the movie Ed Wood, but it was rumored that I think that a lot of people didn't know at the time that Bela Lugosi was still alive. Like Lon Chaney Jr., the end of his career was not the greatest, and the movie Ed Wood explores this. And in his second and final turn as the Count, Bela Lugosi does a pretty fucking A job. In fact, he might have outdone his original performance from the 1931 film. I mean, I've seen Of all the original monster classics, the 31 Dracula, like out of Frankenstein, Dracula the Wolfman, the original Dracula is my personal favorite. Back in 1931, these horror films, they didn't have any real music score to them, and Bela Lugosi's Dracula carried a real subtle creepiness to it, and it's not terrifying or scary, but it has an almost sensual charm to it. And Bela Lugosi himself could carry a good charisma for the character in the original film, and when they do the close-ups of him giving his evil stare, the way they shoot his eyes, they are really... The close-up shots of the eyes are still unnerving to me to this day. In the movie, Wilbur Lou's character makes a point to mention many times just how unsettling Dracula's eyes are, and they really are. Like you can see the power and the evil behind them, and just how he can pretty much get anybody to do what he wants. And the Dracula in this movie, he is very determined and very strong and doesn't really have any weak moments. He carries through the whole film and stays on top until the final climax, which I'll talk about later with the spoiler card. And of course there's the Frankenstein monster, who is not reprised by Boris Karloff. At this point, Karloff was pretty much through with Universal, and he had not worked with them since House of Frankenstein, which was another movie that featured Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, and the Wolfman. An interesting note, despite the three characters appearing in both House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, Dracula never shared any scenes with the monster or the Wolfman. The monster and the Wolfman shared a lot of scenes together. They even had their own movie, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. But in the movies where it had all three, Dracula had his own separate, almost completely different plot line. And then the movie kind of shifted to these other two characters. Maybe the monster in Dracula, I haven't seen House of Dracula in years because I didn't really care for it. But I know that Dracula didn't share any scenes with the Wolfman in that movie. And Karloff, he wasn't approached and didn't really have any interest. He would later work with Abbott and Costello on Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. By the way, that's the real title. Boris Karloff's name is in the title. And he also worked with them on Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that movie, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was the very first Abbott and Costello movie I ever watched, and that movie... Actually, that movie also had a wax museum in it, and that movie, when I first saw it, made me laugh so hard it hurt. The Frankenstein monster... I got a little off track. The Frankenstein monster in this movie is played by Glenn Strange, a very appropriate name according to many others. Glenn had played the monster in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, and even though Karloff is the most famous person to play the character, the image of the Frankenstein monster, like drawing-wise, stamp-wise, promotion-wise, is often associated with the way Glenn Strange looked when he was in the makeup. And he's a great fit for the character. He's 6'7" and has a very hulking look to him. And when I saw Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I was a little confused because once again I had not seen the original monster movies. In this movie, the monster talks. And I don't think this is a spoiler, so I'll tell it. At some point between Abbott and Costello and the original movies, certain events happen that lead to the once mute creature being able to speak. And it was a little inconsistent when he could or could not speak. But in this movie he does. He doesn't say much, because throughout most of the film he's pretty weak and he's under Dracula's influence. And all he ever says is when Dracula commands him, he goes, "Master." And then he's like, "Yes, master. Yes, master." It's very brief, but you do notice it. Yeah, the monster is talking. Interesting fact to know. For this movie, and I read that for also House of Frankenstein, the original Universal mummy was going to appear, but for both movies, Universal, I guess, decided to stop, either for budget reasons or for story. It would have been cool, but yeah, probably would have been a bit much. I spent so much time talking about the monsters, I almost forgot about Abbott and Costello. And before I get to them, I just want to mention, as a sign of how great this classic movie is, in 2001, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was selected for the Library of Congress to be preserved pretty much till the end of time. And all I gotta say is, and about 2 years ago, Pulp Fiction was put into the Library of Congress, which owes a lot of its tone to Abbott and Costello. Now on to the famous duo themselves. Bud Abbott as Chick. Interesting name. Not sure a lot of people in the 40s were named Chick. And there really wasn't much to Bud Abbott. Like, okay, he was the self-centered asshole that treat Lou like shit and would do a bunch of horrible things, mostly to make money or to scam people, usually Lou. But he could be funny, he could have a sarcastic one-liner, but in the end, Lou Costello was really the only thing that really made the group stand out. Like Bud, the only purpose he served was to just slap Lou. Like, I know straight men are usually not supposed to be funny, but god damn, Bud Abbott hardly ever contributed anything. Maybe I'm overstating a bit, but that's kind of the vibe and the feeling I got from watching all their movies. And the character Chick, he's just about like any other Bud Abbott character. But like some of them, towards the end, you can tell he does care about Lou. He still beats him more than a drunk does to his wife, but yeah, you can see there's a kind of care there. Yeah, it's an abusive relationship, but you can tell Bud does care a little. You just probably smack him around for several hours and then make up and then repeat it. Yeah. Their characters, this is one relationship that definitely needs counseling. And Lou Costello? Oh boy. He was a comic legend. Lou, when I watched him when I was little, I didn't really see him as being that fat. Like, maybe it's because more he was short, and he did have a very round face and a very thick neck, but he really wasn't the biggest overweight comedian that I'd ever seen. Maybe he was big for the time, but Oliver Hardy was, I think, was the bigger fat comedian at the time. And Lou, his goofiness, well, in some of the later films and some of the earlier films, depending on how much he did it, his goofiness and his silliness, it really does work here. And he doesn't really play that likable of a character. And a big contribution to what makes him work is just how stupid he is. And he is really fucking stupid in this movie. Not like any more than he was in the others, but since it was one of the first Abbott and Costello movies I ever saw, I think maybe this is what made it work for me and why it still works now. And his character, Wilbur, is very gullible. He probably doesn't experience that much romance, which is why when Dracula's partner, Sandra Monet, comes on to him and acts like she's... This may be an old phrase, but this is an old movie. Over the moon for Lou. I can see why he would jump for her. And him being in love is some of the funniest shit I have ever seen out of Lou Costello. He's just... He acts so... He's like, I'm floating on a cloud of love. And then Bud's like, listen, you little blimp, I'll let that air out of you in a second. Understand? And then he slams a bag in his head, and Lou's like, thank you. And Bud's like, boy, is this kid lost. And then there's another funny bit where Lou is jealous, and to try and make the woman he's jealous of jealous, he just grabs Bud and tries to dance him going, I'm in love! Something I noticed when I rewatched Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and I'll explain why I think this, but Lou Costello, like, especially in this movie, he comes off as very gay. And what I mean by that is, a lot of his characteristics and his mannerisms, the way he acts and his personality, it's what you'd associate with a lot of classic or slash stereotypical gay characteristics and stuff that you would see openly gay actors or comedians do. And it's a little funny seeing him be romantic with these woman characters, because it's kind of like the Can't Stop the Music movie. You know, if anyone remembers the Village People movie from 1980, where the Village People playing themselves, and most of them were gay, they didn't try to hide that they were gay at all in their performances, but the studio, I guess, was nervous about having a movie with gay characters, so they had poorly done scenes put in of each character flirting with a woman, and it's just not convincing. And it has the same kind of feeling here with Lou Costello. In case anyone's wondering, Lou Costello was straight, so I don't know. And I guess the best way to put it is, Lou Costello reminds me a lot of Cam from Modern Family. And I can see a lot of similarities between Lou Costello and Nathan Lane. And yeah, I think that's a good way to describe him. He's kind of like Nathan Lane. And I don't know, it's just funny, like, if you were to have a character who was heterosexual do this today, there would be a bunch of people thinking, this is the worst attempt by a gay actor at playing a straight character. But either way, he is fucking hilarious. Just something I noticed. And furthermore, with the character Wilbur, he has a lot of flaws. Mainly being, there's this woman who he thinks is in love with him, and he just is so stricken with her, and then I mentioned that part of the plot is that an insurance company is investigating Bud and Lou, thinking that they stole what they thought were wax dummies of the monsters. And the insurance agent that they send to try and find them. The insurance agent character is my least favorite character in this movie. The parts with her are the only parts of this movie that I hate. It hurts to say that, but yeah, I am... This Asian character is named Joan Raymond, and every derogative word I could think of for this woman... bitch, whore, slut, cunt, twat, piece of shit. She knocks on Bud and Lou's apartment door, and Lou, thinking it's Sandra, sticks out his lips for a kiss with his eyes closed. Then all of a sudden she leans in and kisses him. It was just so... Even when I was 10, when I first saw this movie, that scene really bothered me and pissed me off. And I'll get into what separates the Joan Raymond character from the Sandra Monet character in a minute. But this Joan character, she just... Going back to what I said about unlikable characters, she is a smug and manipulative and just self-serving bitch. And when I tried writing a review of this movie when I was 10 or 11, I just let loose with my little kid anger on this character. And she's basically... She's like a non-violent, non-murder intent femme fatale who is just using Lou, and I hate that. And I guess that what pisses me off is during the course of the film, the character Joan Raymond, she's briefly put under Dracula's influence, but she never really suffers for anything. And I know that... I don't know if it's the filmmaker's intent, but the way it comes off is the audience is supposed to give it a pass because she's supposedly a pretty woman. And please, if anything, she looks like a cheap whore. I really hate this character, and when I hate something really much, I guess the worst comes out. And Lou, apparently amazed that more than one woman would love him, he decides to try and see both women, and yeah, I got a problem with that. Yeah, he's just two-timer. But he does suffer a lot, mostly through... So, I guess it's a bit even. And going back to the Sandra character, who I haven't really gone into that much, but now's a good time as ever. The Sandra character definitely is a femme fatale in a way. And I'll admit, I don't like femme fatale characters really. Characters who manipulate men and use them for their own benefit and then get away with it scot-free. Or if they do suffer, they don't suffer as bad as they deserve. Sometimes it can work. I think the main femme fatales I hate are the ones that are smug and mawkish about it and just come off as a dumb slut other than a evil genius. It's what made Kim Novak work in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and what made Eva Green fail in Frank Miller's Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. And also, when the character is supposed to be the most beautiful woman on the planet, and every man who sees her, lays eyes on her, just falls under her influence. And usually the actresses they get, although kind of cute, look very fuckable, they don't look like the most beautiful women on the fucking planet. And what I think is beautiful could differ from what is considered the norm of most people. And by the norm, I mean people who don't have autism. And I guess what makes the Sandra character, because from what I've described, yes, she is using Lou, and it's sort of for her own benefit, but it's also for Dracula's, who has more of a control over her. But I think what makes the character Sandra work is Lenore Aubert, the actress who plays her. Unlike Jane Randolph, who plays Joan Raymond, Lenore Aubert, she is a good actress, and Lenore could bring more personality and more. Even though Abbott and Costello movies weren't known for giving their characters a ton of depth, Lenore is the kind of actress, at least in this movie, who could give the character depth and personality and make her interesting just through her delivery of the lines and the tone and emotion she uses. And she is actually pretty scary and intimidating at times, which separates her from the Joan character. The character of Sandra Monet, I thought she was a good villain. A common thing that I find in movies that I have a problem with is when there's female characters who do horrible things and the filmmakers expect the audience to let it slide because they're hot or pretty. That never happens with me, and it doesn't here, but Lenore Aubert, she is intimidating and very interesting, and at times, even for a 40s film where sexiness was a big no-no, she is pretty sexy. And I don't usually like women with accents, because accents can be real grating or gag-worthy, but she does have a very sexy voice. And there is only one time in the movie where she develops kind of a smug bitch attitude, and it's when she tries to go against Dracula's orders, but she gets hers. Dracula commands her after she says with a smug-ass grin that her will is as strong as his. "Look into my eyes. Look into my eyes." And she looks. Strong will indeed. And Dracula bites her on the neck, showing that when you bitch against Dracula, you become one of Dracula's bitches. And after that scene, she's pretty much, Dracula's bitch. She follows everything he says, and she has no control whatsoever anymore. But she still has some pretty good, interesting scenes, and her voice is both one of the sexiest and one of the scariest things to her character. You can sense the seductiveness but you can also sense that this is a person who would easily kill you. And there's this great scene where after Dr. Monet has been bitten by Dracula, she tries to use her charm on Lou Costello at a costume party. Yeah, this can only end well. And when she says, "I want to be in your blood," Lou suddenly wises up for one of the few times in his life, and he gets that she's working with Dracula, and she tells him to look into her eyes, which leads to a real funny scene where, looking into her eyes, he sees bats flying, and Lou staring, just kind of mugs for the camera. And when he says he doesn't want to look anymore, she's like, "Of course you do. Don't you know what's going to happen next?" And Lou says, "I'll bite." And then she says, "Oh no, I will." And then she puts her hand on his shirt collar and pulls it back, and Lou, suddenly jolted, stops her, and then someone calls out and she bolts. And this scene I find to be, even though it has everything, this scene is funny and tense, and it's chilling. Like the moment she puts her hand on his neck, when it seems like she's going to bite him, watching that scene after 10 years, it still sends shivers down my spine, both out of how chilling it is and how sexy it is. Yeah, a scene with Lou Costello, I think, is sexy, and I will defend my opinion of that forever. It's a great scene. It's one of my favorites in the movie, not to feature the monsters. And overall, just about everybody does a great job, except for Jane Randolph. Maybe she was good in other stuff, but here she's fucking horrible. Oh, and a fact that's interesting to mention is that even though it's a goof, in the scene where Dracula bites Dr. Monet, he's doing it in front of a mirror where you can clearly see Dracula. And as far as I remember, vampires are not supposed to be visible in the mirror. It's a small thing, and I let it slide. It's not serious. I mean, there have been worser fuck-ups with vampire lore and horror. Something I will not let slide, even though I love this movie so much, is that throughout the film, the Wolfman constantly turns into the Wolfman. In fact, the movie takes place over the course of only a few days, but in that time, Lawrence Talbot becomes the Wolfman a total of 4 fucking times. No. That is not how a werewolf works. And the only other characters worth mentioning in the film is the owner of the Wax Museum, who thinks Bud and Lou stole his shit, named Mr. McDougal, played by Frank Ferguson. And the character Mr. McDougal is just a complete cunt. He's one of the biggest assholes I've ever seen in a movie. And he's an asshole from his very first scene where he shows up at the baggage claim and he starts screaming and yelling, and he really has no reason to. You have to see this character to believe just what a complete putz he is. And the other character is this guy called Dr. Stevens, played by Charles Bradstreet. He's not a huge part of the movie until the final climax, and there's not much to say about this character other than he becomes stricken over Joan Raymond. Yeah, I don't buy it. And he participates a bit in the climax. Something I notice in a lot of Abbott and Costello movies is that there's usually another main man character who is in some way the romantic lead who'd usually get his own movie. But here, it's like the studio realized Bud and Lou could never pass for romantic leads, so they gave it to someone else. I always had issue with this because it kind of distracts from just who is the main focus of the story. But it's not too bad. The main climax of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is fucking incredible. It is magnificent, and I'm just going to describe it now. The climax has Lou having been kidnapped by Dr. Monet and Dracula, and they're planning to put his brain in the Frankenstein monster. Before it happens, Lou's like, "Frankie boy, don't let him do it to you. Frank, I've had this brain for 30 years and it hasn't served me right once." Lou, you're not 30. You were not 30 when this movie came out. And then Bud and the Wolfman. And at this point, Bud is wised up to the monsters being real, and he works with the Wolfman to stop them. And when they first try to rescue Lou, he's in a dungeon, and he goes, "Dracula's gonna use my brain to make a bigger dummy out of the other dummy." And leads to a lot of good slapstick, and eventually Dracula recaptures Lou. So they bust in just as they're about to slice open his head with a scalpel. And Lawrence Talbot tries to unstrap Lou from the operating table. And then all of a sudden he looks up and we see it's a full moon. And Lou's like, "What's happening?" And then he looks down and we see two furry hands on Lou's stomach. He turns his head and it's the Wolfman. And that, I think, is probably one of the greatest, even though we don't see the transition, it's one of the best werewolf transformation scenes I've ever seen from that era of film. And the makeup for the Wolfman, although it is a little hokey, I think the fact that it's in black and white helps make it work. And the growling and just the sneer, the sinister sneer of the makeup, it, for the most part, makes the monster work. And then Lou has the most appropriate reaction you would have if you were talking to a man and then all of a sudden he's a werewolf. Exactly. And the Frankenstein monster at this point finally gets up, and this leads to Bud and Lou running for their lives while Dracula and the Wolfman duke it out. And while trying to get away from the monster, they go into a bedroom and try to barricade the door with a bed, and they don't realize the door opens outward, so the monster just comes in. And Lou, trying to escape, grabs the bedsheet, just throws it over his head. And it looks like this. I think that's the funniest image I've seen of the Frankenstein monster. Unless you count Herman Munster on the Munsters. And the climax eventually leads to the supposed deaths of Dracula and the Wolfman. I feel were a little cop-out-ish and a little sad, I guess, for the Wolfman. I feel like the Wolfman should have gotten a better send-off, since this would be Lon Chaney's last time as the character. But the true great send-off is to the Frankenstein monster, where Bud and Lou run down the docks. They're at an island, and they get in a boat, and as the monster tries to throw barrels at them, the Dr. Stevens character takes a can of gasoline, several cans, throws it on the dock, and he sets it on fire. And the monster, this is a little confusing. The monster used to be afraid of fire in all previous incarnations of the Frankenstein saga, but here he's for some reason drawn to the fire. And when the entire dock is set on fire, the monster just lurches over it, and as he walks in, he has a vacant face, and he just opens his mouth looking like he's just horrified at what's happening to him. And he pretty much burns up. And we see this great shot of the monster's upper body as he's in the flames. Not sure if there's probably no symbolism here, but I just think it's a very haunting shot of the Frankenstein monster being engulfed in the flames. And I think I need to wrap this up quick, so it was a great climax, and a few fun facts to know. When Bud and Lou are trying to hide from the monster, they quickly shove him into a room and lock the door. And when they think they got him, Lou's like, "We got him!" The monster punches through the door, hitting Lou right in the side of the head. And Lou Costello deliberately stepped off his mark to get hit, so his face is real. Glenn Strange broke his ankle one day during filming when he tripped over a cable wire for one of the cameras. So they needed someone to fill in, and the only tall person they had who was available that day was Lon Chaney Jr., who had played the Frankenstein monster previously in The Ghost of Frankenstein. So Lon Chaney played two monsters in this movie, which is pretty cool. He plays him for the scene where the monster picks up Dr. Monet and just throws her out a window. And the very last thing to mention about the climax is, after all the monsters have apparently been killed, Lou says to Bud, "The next time I say I saw something when I saw it, you believe me that I saw it." And Bud's like, "Now that Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman are gone, there's no one left to frighten us." And as he says this, we see a cigarette floating in the air, and then we hear a voice go, "Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get on the excitement." "Who said that?" Then they look at the smoke coming out of nowhere going, "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man." And then they just jump overboard. I will admit, the ending is very abrupt. So are a lot of Abbott and Costello's movies, and I guess next to the Joan Raymond character, the abrupt ending is the only other thing I have to complain about. But it doesn't ruin the movie. It's still an amazing film, and I think the coolest thing is, aside from the fact that Bud and Lou would later do a movie where they meet the Invisible Man, this cameo by the Invisible Man at the very end of the movie, the voice, although it's only brief, is Vincent Price, who had, 8 years earlier, played the Invisible Man in The Invisible Man Returns for Universal. And I think this was all before Vincent Price really became a star, so it's all over pretty cool. So that's my review for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, a true horror comedy classic and one of my favorite films from my childhood and a movie that I still love today. And I have more horror reviews coming. The very last thing I'll say before I go, the movie was directed by Charles Burton, a sort of Academy Award winner, and he was a favorite amongst Bud and Lou, made a few films with them. And Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was written by Robert Lees, Frederick I. Rinaldo, and John Grant. I give Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein 8.7 out of 10, and I recommend anyone who loves classic movies, black and white movies, mixtures of horror and comedy, or genres in general, check it out. I'll see you next weekend with another horror classic.